Hey, it's Joey from EDH Rec, and I didn't want to talk about this, but I guess I'm gonna. So Wizards of the Coast announced a new brackets update a little bit ago, and we did a reaction stream that day, and in that stream we mostly stuck to the discussion of the removals of game changers and some of the new guidelines around the brackets and the language that had been cleaned up there, stuff like that. But Wizards also dropped this thing at the end of that announcement about changing the hybrid mana rule, potentially. And that actually took me by surprise, mostly because I thought that topic had died out like 10 or 15 years ago. I wasn't going to make a video about this, especially because I've been dealing with some health stuff the past couple weeks, but there's an angle here that kind of is just staying in my mind. So I feel like I've got to speak on it. I have to remark on this, and therefore I am indeed throwing my hat into the ring after all. Wizards asked for people's feedback, so Wizards of the Coast, here is my feedback from the perspective of a person who once was on team change the hybrid mana rule, but who today would not vote for that change. For some quick shoutouts, I think that these videos cover the subject very nicely. Tomer, Blood Artist, and the Command Zone cover the subject matter in ways that I think you should check out if you haven't already. Kudos to them. Also, yes, I've got my notes right over here. I'm sorry if this video isn't as presentational as you are used to me being. I've redone this video and reshot it so many times that I'm honestly just going to try and keep it kind of low key now. And I'm going to try and construct this as a, what would I say to the council if they let me hold the conch sort of situation. And I'm honestly going to try and ignore that an audience is even here. And on that note, like and subscribe, I guess. I'm so bad at this. All right. So far, when people have asked for my take, I have said, if you can find a simpler color identity rule than the one that currently exists, then I'm listening. However, I haven't seen proof of a simpler, more intuitive rule just yet. I think the proposed rule change actually gets kind of close to that line, but I don't think that it meets the assignment enough to warrant that change. So, hybrid mana is made to be either or. Sure, we all understand that that is what the cards are designed for and why. Up front, though, we also have to acknowledge that what a thing is made for, the intent behind it, doesn't really matter here. What a card or design is intended for would be a pretty horrible metric by which to adjudicate the rules of a game. Case in point, companions were not intended to be broken. Clearly, the intent of a designer does not hold enough weight as a very strong foundation for an argument. Like every statement of this is how the mechanic was intended to work could be countered with, well, this rule is how Commander as a format was intended to work. So you see how those aren't really productive lines of argumentation here? And the reason I'm starting here at design intention is because in this very announcement, in this announcement article, in the material published so far by Wizards, that idea of intent takes center stage in a really uncomfortable way. I kind of can't help but feel a little bit squirmy about it. Quote, in Magic, hybrid cards are made to be playable by either color. That's how they work in all of Magic. If I have a Kitchen Finks, I can put it in my mono-white deck or my mono-green deck. Commander is a place where it's the opposite. You can't put it in either a mono-white or mono-green deck. I want to get to my full perspective, but this particular line from the article demands acknowledgement before any perspective can be given or even heard. Note the exclamation point at the end of this statement here, as though this line is highlighting some complete absurdity. You can't put it in either a mono-white or a mono-green deck, as if it's being uttered by a Victorian lady on the verge of fainting. Yes, in Commander, you can't do that. In Commander, you also can't play a 60-card deck or run 4 copies of every card. In Modern, you don't have a little legendary guy sitting outside of your deck. In Pauper, you can't play rares. In Dan, you're playing from a shared library. They are different formats with different rules, and some of those rules will sound absurd if you choose to characterize them in an absurd way. Just, we'd love your feedback, immediately followed by, in Standard and Modern, I could do this, but in Commander, I can't, simply comes off as biased. Objection, Your Honor, counsel is leading the witness. This is not an objective way to ask for feedback. It comes off as an attempt to nudge a reader towards a specific, predestined conclusion. Truly, you can fashion that type of argumentative structure to say just about anything. It's my new copy pasta. Colorless lands are made to be playable in any deck. That's how they work in all of Magic. If I have a Westvale Abbey, I could put it into my mono-red deck or my Simic deck. Commander is a place where it's the opposite. You can't put it in either a mono-red deck or a Simic deck. See why that line is so annoying to me now? It's just mocking a rule of a format insincerely. Mountains are made to be playable in any deck, but in Dan it's the opposite. You can't play mountains or forests. You can make that type of rhetorical structure say anything, but it offers nothing. If I was in a rule council discussion and that was the type of argumentative construction that came forward during discussion, even if I shared your position, even if I was going to vote the same way that you were, I'd want to call that shit out. It's just very unbecoming. And it kind of continues with the next line too. Allowing hybrid would give decks with fewer colors better tools and options to play. It allows for more playable options. I'm just saying the framing here is one-sided. In Wizards' request for feedback about changing the rule, they also only made positive statements about one half of the argument, and declared those statements as though they are objective, inalienable truths. So, Wizards, I hate that. If I were in your council, I would feel that there is clearly an agenda underneath your words if that is how topics get presented. First, we have to remove the bias from the framing before we can poll opinion objectively. I don't know, I just think that this is a pretty insincere way to construct an argument, let alone an insincere way to probe for feedback. Currently, it feels like you're framing this as a noble pursuit that benefits players, when actually there might be a different underlying motivation after all. And yes, this is going to come up again later. But to move on. Now, another reason that a designer's intent doesn't matter a whit is because of all of the other usual suspects that this discussion immediately invokes. Two-bird mana, Phyrexian mana, color indicators as seen on Pact of Negation or Westfell Abbey, split cards, cards that can be cast in weird ways. Each of these is also intended to be usable in decks that don't contain every single color in their identity. Phyrexian Metamorph is designed to be playable in mono green, Wear and Tear is designed to be playable in mono white, so is Archangel Avacyn, and Beseech the Queen could be playable in mono red. And heck, Dread Return is designed to be flashbacked even in decks that don't include black at all. In fact, that is how I first ever encountered that card. See again why intent doesn't really matter? We're obviously not going to change the rule on all of those cards, so let's move on to the important thing about this though. Let's say there's a spectrum. On the one end is having no rule for color identity at all, free for all, play anything. And on the other end is the current rule. Here's a way of calculating color identity, and if a thing doesn't fit within that box, you ain't playing it in that deck. I think we can all agree that this end of the spectrum, having no restriction at all, is a pretty bad idea for the Commander format, and thankfully no one is arguing to do away with color identity entirely. And yes, cards like Fierce Guardianship are a very good reason why we don't want to live in that reality. People who support the hybrid rule change are asking us to move from this position to somewhere else, to budge into another place within that spectrum, to move from a Kinsey 0 to a Kinsey 2. And there are many coherent arguments about why the hybrid mana rules change is fundamentally a different thing than Phyrexian mana or split cards or whatever. I don't think everyone is making coherent arguments right now, but I've heard enough coherent arguments to understand why people feel it's a different enough thing that it doesn't feel like cherry picking from among these examples to change things for hybrid, but to not change them for Phyrexian mana or whatever. Like, yeah, Phyrexian mana is a different thing. That makes perfect sense to me too. And fair cop to this as well, there are indeed new or novice players who do not find the current rules about hybrid mana to be very intuitive. We all may forget that as, enfranchised players who've been in this reality for a long time, but confusion from an outside perspective is also a reasonable motivation for a rules change. So yeah, I understand why people feel like this change is a pretty small step into the spectrum and not some giant leap. However, the fact that this very announcement does not have certainty about two-bird mana shows that even the new line that they want to draw is still a little bit blurry, right? And frankly, and I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but based on my experiences teaching new players, which I've done a lot, color indicators are a much less intuitive thing for them than hybrid mana tends to be. It's just my experience, but I just think it's very unintuitive to be told that you can play Waves of Aggression in your mono-white deck, but you can't play Archangel Avacyn in your mono-white deck, despite that card having no red pips on it. I have met several Super Friends players who had a Flip Garruk in their budget Planeswalkers deck, not realizing that was technically not allowed. I have met players, again, plural players, who thought that having a Grist or Tameo as a commander meant that you had to play a mono green or a mono blue deck. Even this screenshot from Wizards' own commander website shows how a lot of emphasis is placed on mana pips rather than things like color indicators as guides for deck construction. The current rule primes players to scope out mana symbols as their North Star. So all I'm saying is that from an outside perspective, this is also an area where I see some people get confused because this kind of thing isn't that simple. A color indicator is something that takes an extra step. Point is, if we're drawing new lines on that spectrum, wherever you put hybrid mana and two-brid mana, I personally have color indicators behind them. I don't have those on the other side of that line still. And maybe that's a hot take, I don't know, whatever. My specific feeling there doesn't actually matter, because the real point is that drawing that line in a new place on that spectrum is inevitably muddy. It obviously is going to invoke questions and confusion and make the rule a little bit weirder. It makes it harder to know, at a glance, what cards you can play or expect to see, rather than fostering an experience that is simple, a rule that you can grok after hearing it just one time. You know, look at the colors, look at the pips, and you're all good. It's simple. There is elegance there. And I argue that the current clean sweep, no exceptions rule is cleaner and achieves an ease of game experience as is, and that strictly for the purposes of deck building, you can treat a hybrid symbol as either of its two colors, while coming close doesn't achieve what a rule like this ought to achieve, and will not serve as a stronger load-bearing wall of the format than what we currently have. Basically, it ain't broke, so don't fix it. I vote no. But it's not just about simplicity of rules, it's also about whether or not it enhances the game experience, if Commander as a format mechanically improves from a change like this. And in terms of that question, well, unfortunately, I won't be answering that directly. My opinion on that doesn't matter to Wizards. Unfortunately, I have to meet that question with the reality that that's not actually 100% of Wizards' motivation here. So if it's not 100% of their focus, it won't be 100% of mine either, and I'll meet the council instead where it's actually at. Given current trends and various habits at Wizards of the Coast, and indeed the way that Hasbro continues to breathe down WotC's neck, I have found it reasonable during coverage of this entire subject to constantly ask, is this proposed move really being done because Wizards authentically thinks it is a mechanical improvement to the Commander format experience, or is it being proposed because they want to make their jobs easier when designing cards for the Commander format? I had that sentiment, that line, in my script locked and loaded like a week ago, and then, lo and behold, Command Zone made a video yesterday and confirmed an angle on this that I had not yet heard during coverage of this subject, and which sent me into a scramble to reshoot and re-edit this very video. Command Zone mentioned that actually seems a real concern with Wizards here is indeed the flexibility that this rules change would afford to its designers, and that this is especially connected to their execution of Universes Beyond sets, hybrid mana giving them more flexibility when making cards for those types of sets. Cool, good to know. I wish we had started there. Why were we trussing up the relaunch of this conversation with talking points that sound like they're putting the players first, if that's not actually the ultimate motivation here, if the real motivation is actually primarily kind of this other thing? In every previous iteration of this video, I had this line, you want to change a rule, okay, why? Why really? Wizards, y'all are the ones that taught me that restrictions breed creativity, so why are you trying to remove one of your restrictions? And now, after weeks, I finally know. It wasn't in the announcement article or video or stream, but at least I know now, I guess. I'm reacting here to what I'm perceiving as a slight dishonesty. And that's why I hate this debate, because this whole time it feels like we weren't even actually able to get to the real point. Like, don't get me wrong, I already know that money is the real motivation behind every Wizards decision. That's the motivation behind every set. That's a given. Seriously, people who are out there worried about whether a rules change would let Wizards print pushed hybrid cards, y'all, they're going to print powerful cards regardless, so please relax. That is not the focus of this conversation. But really, I just feel like this request for feedback was done in a way that encourages the kinds of discussion that it ultimately turns out Wizards already knows that they themselves will not find as important or persuasive. Is this rules change being proposed because it's chiefly an obstacle for players, or is it chiefly an obstacle for designers? And why is it being purported to be an obstacle for players first and foremost, if the designer part is also a really important ingredient that you want feedback about? So, to the actual question of whether changing a solid rule of the game is worth the payoff of affording more ease and flexibility to designers, if a little give on this end helps out a lot on that other end, unfortunately, my answer would still be no. Not just because I dislike the way that this all was presented, but because I agree with the original vision, that the restriction is the point. because I happen to agree with Tomer. I can be on board with a change if it is a net benefit to players, but I don't think that that has been demonstrated to be true in this instance. And because I think that this rule is actually a more important load-bearing wall. I don't know how many grains of sand you can remove from a beach before it becomes a different beach, but this feels like a lot of sand to me. Prior rules changes have felt like smaller amounts of sand, like the tuck rule, or the color production outside of color identity, or even the recent change from Edge of Eternities allowing vehicles and stations to be commanders. Not all universally praised changes, but for the most part, those changes made in those specific ways, while yes, removing a small amount of sand from the beach, still felt like small amounts of sand from the beach, because those changes acknowledged that the rules as they were then written at that time no longer served the function that they needed to serve. Like making red mana in a Send Triplets deck. It's actually not that big of a deal. Tucking a commander. Having that as a rule actually causes some weird incentives with removal and deck building. Stations as commanders. It's probably okay to lean into the rule of cool here. These have felt like small changes to that beach. However, I maintain that the current color identity rules still are serving their purpose well, creating strict lines of a sandbox that we can play in. That serves a purpose that helps to reinforce things like creativity, identity, and aesthetic, and those are not things that we have moved on from needing enforcement for. Yes, the aesthetic too. That actually holds a lot of weight in this conversation. 100 cards is an aesthetic choice, after all. Having a commander at all, that's also about the aesthetic. It's just kind of cool to have a leader. There's self-expression tied up in that. And I believe that the aesthetic benefit of your commander capping to no more than these colors as a rule also has a great benefit, because that feeling being pleasing feeds into a rule of cool that helps to capture players' interest in the first place. By tying your card pool to what your commander permits, you are in small ways guided towards making creative choices that allow your deck to become more distinct. Plus, there's also a visually pleasing bonus to all of this, where, aside from the famously ungovernable fetch lands and the occasional Urborg-style hack, the deck looks like it's all of the right colors when you're just thumbing through it at a passing glance. It might not seem like a lot, but it's in the small details, you know? As the designers at Wizards of the Coast love to say, restrictions breed creativity. But they also breed identity. I'll quote the musician Brian Eno here. Whatever you now find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. CD distortion, the jitteriness of digital video, the crap sound of 8-bit, all of these will be cherished and emulated just as soon as they can be avoided. This quote is obviously talking about like Atari systems and VHS recording technology, but I still think it applies here. This color identity restriction, which some of you may find to be a frustration, is also, to others, a restriction that helps to define this format's unique charm. Over time, that's how I've come to feel about this rule. It is uniquely charming. And even if you don't think that it is as much of a load-bearing wall of the format as I perceive it to be, I still think that it is a restriction worth preserving. Even if you just perceive it to be a coat of paint upon that wall, I still think that coat of paint is making the wall a whole lot prettier. So, given all of that, you can see why I was pretty disappointed to watch that unique charm of the format get willfully misunderstood in an insincere way with flawed rhetorical devices within official Wizards announcement material. Why is it being officially announced in this way? I think that coat of paint is rather pretty, actually. I don't think it needs to look like all of the other walls do. Maybe people will consider this next part to be a slippery slope argument, whatever, I'm not that invested in it, but based off of stuff like that, that is the kind of thing that I feel pushes people to wonder whether, if Wizards did another War of the Spark style set, that they would once again push to try and make Planeswalkers into commanders too. Because it would be really good for their marketing if that was the case. But marketing, like card intention, is a bad motivation for making rules changes. Just as much as I don't want bans and unbans, or lack of bans and unbans, to be primarily motivated by $signs and bottom lines, I don't want rules changes to be motivated by that either. I think we lose the plot when we do that. I don't think that it puts players first or prioritizes game health. And the reason that I keep on hammering on that point so much is because I think art is made best when it's made by artists, not when it's made by accountants. My point is that I'm trying to figure out what the actual motivation motivations are here. What are the actual things that Wizards is receptive to? Because the motivations were not up front. They were hidden behind different excuses that purported to center the player's experience, when the actual issue that needs some focus is clearly centered on the experiences of the designers. This particular rules change honestly doesn't even matter that much, but the motivations behind rules changes are pretty important to know now, because those are the motivations that will lead into rules changes that happen in the future. So unfortunately, right now, given current understanding with what I can actually glean, things that make a designer's job easier and things that make a healthy format don't share enough alignment and overlap for me to endorse a change on that basis, especially not when compared with the strength that I think the format is afforded by having cleaner restrictions. I like this part of the beach, and I think a lot of other people like it enough too that it is wiser to keep it. There's a burden of proof that must be met when attempting to propose a change like this, and unfortunately for me, I don't think that burden has quite been met by the folks who are encouraging this change. And also, to be frank, while this does open up some doors for future design possibilities, I am also just kind of curious about the other things in the future that could be created. I think it's very possible for Wizards to create some other coloring mechanic in the future that also will feel to some folks like it is behind the line where they've drawn hybrid mana. And what confusion will that cause in the future? It's just also something to keep in mind. Wizards, I'm not on your council, I'm not on the Commander format panel, but all of this is what goes through my head. I have some slight frustrations about the way that this particular topic was presented. It honestly feels as though this is a foregone conclusion. The way that all of this has come off has felt to me as though you've already made up your mind, in which case trying to get feedback has felt pointless. And that's a bit disheartening to feel right now. I don't want to believe that that is true. I'm just saying that that is how this has all come off. That feeling, it sucks, man. We do all already know that you already win. You can make whatever move that you want to make, regardless of what community says or the panel says or whatever. That was made abundantly clear with this. Did you mean to do that? Have you already made up your mind? When I'm in the thick of things, to hold myself accountable, I suppose, I like to ask myself what arguments could persuade me away from the position I currently have. And I think right now I know what assurances I would need to be moved away from my current stance on this subject. Things like find me a color of paint for the wall, speaking of metaphor here, that a lot of us can all agree is intuitively more pleasing. Or demonstrate that the new beach, again with my metaphors, is indeed better and that it's being looked after responsibly. I think you know what I mean by stuff like that. But let's turn that question around here. What things could move you away from your current position? What are the values underlying every single argument that has been made? And how are each of those values being weighed? And is all of that clear to the people from whom you've sought input? These are the kinds of things that I would ask if I was there, and I like to think that it's also what I would ask if I was you. Anyway, I would vote no. You asked for feedback, and all of that is mine, and I hope that I've been able to present my reasoning and indeed some of my frustrations in ways that meet you where you're at and that help with the issues that actually cause you the most concern, and in a way that y'all will understand where I'm coming from. It's been a privilege. I thank you for your time.